This is Judaism Unbound, episode 128, Zionism 3.0. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And we're thrilled to welcome back to the podcast Zack Bodner, the Chief Executive Officer of the Ashman Family JCC in Palo Alto. Palo Alto is an interesting place because in addition to all the technological development that we know about and related to that, there is a large population of Israeli expatriates or Israelis who are visiting for a shorter period of time. As such, the Palo Alto JCC runs a lot of programs for the local community of Israelis and also does a lot of thinking about Zionism and the future of Israel and the future of the American-Jewish relationship with Israel. It's also notable that before coming to work at the Palo Alto JCC, Zack served for 14 years as the Pacific Northwest Regional Director for AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. He has spoken and written widely on the subject of Zionism and Israel, and under his leadership, the Palo Alto JCC launched the Zionism 3.0 conference, which is one of the most prominent conferences looking thoughtfully at this topic of our podcast today, the relationship of Israel and American Jews in this next stage of the development of both. So, Zack, we're thrilled to welcome you back to Judaism Unbound to talk about a topic that's dear to your heart. Zack Bodner, welcome back to Judaism Unbound. Great to have you.
Great to be back.
Well, we're really glad to be talking to you about this topic because it's one that definitely has been a major part of your personal and professional life, but it's one where, interestingly, as the executive director of the JCC in Palo Alto, you're innovating in this area. And I think it's really interesting to understand a little bit about how you've been thinking about Israel and Zionism from where you sit in Palo Alto, both in terms of the environment of innovation and also in terms of what you're seeing on the ground. For folks who don't know, Palo Alto and the surrounding area actually has a huge population of expatriate Israelis who, of course, don't admit that they're expatriates, and they all say they're going back next year, and many of them will, but there's a large community there. And so there's a lot going on in your area. And just as a place to start, you launched a conference a few years ago called the Zionism 3.0 conference, which we want to understand a little bit in terms of how you're coming at these questions that we've been raising about the future of the American-Jewish relationship with Israel. And to start out, I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of a sense of what were Zionism 1.0 and 2.0 so that, where is this entering into the history of Zionism in your view?
If you think of Zionism 1.0 as the aspirational Zionism of Theodor Herzl, pre-1948 Zionism, and then Zionism 2.0 was basically 1948 until roughly the turn of the century. It was the Zionism of reality, the Zionism of actually building a state of Israel. And it was defined by this ethos of those diaspora Jews that they would either go back, they would make Aliyah, and they would actually build the state from the ground up, or they would stay in the diaspora and they would support Israel. They would support Israel financially, diplomatically, politically. And the defining ethos of Zionism 2.0 was that Jews in the diaspora would have a stake in what happens in Israel, but they wouldn't have a say. But then by the dawn of the 21st century, the situation changed. We kind of saw the failure of the Oslo peace process. We saw the start of the Second Intifada. And it triggered a wave of diaspora Jewry concern. Part of that was obviously the concern for Jew safety, Israel's safety, but part of it was also, hey, how is Israel handling the situation? Are they doing everything the right way, the ethical way, the moral way to combat terrorism? And this was also roughly the time that the question of who is a Jew took on more urgency. In the Knesset, there was some legislation introduced that was going to make only Orthodox conversions kosher. And this is when I think kind of Zionism 3.0 was born, which is this idea of maybe Jews in the diaspora should have a stake and a say. At least it's a question mark, right? Maybe we're not answering the question, but we're asking the question. Because this is the first time in Jewish history where there's been both a strong Jewish homeland and a strong Jewish diaspora, mainly in America. But these two centers of Jewish life are making incredible contributions to the Jewish future. And the question is, are we going to continue to act in parallel and sometimes intersect, or are we going to drift apart? So that's kind of the idea of what Zionism 3.0 is and where we came to the terminology for it.
And so when you talk about this Zionism 3.0, I have two questions in mind. One is this something that you're hoping to bring about, or is this something that you're describing as already existing? Because the question, in a way, for me is I guess I'm wondering whether Zionism 3.0 only exists in America, or if Zionism 3.0 also exists in Israel. Because it's clear that the American Jewish community, or at least a lot of folks in the American Jewish community at best, are hoping for what you're describing as Zionism 3.0. They're demanding a say. They're perhaps saying that their support of Israel's contingent on a say or on changes in the way that Israel is. And there was that survey recently that indicated that a lot of Israelis don't seem to really care very much what American Jews think of them and think in general. And so, how do you put those two pieces together?
Look, I think that Zionism 3.0 is here whether we like it or not. On the one hand, American Jews have to recognize what the relationship, an authentic relationship with Israeli Jewry means in the state of Israel. It means a respectful, familial relationship with Israel, even if you don't agree with all their policies and their government and their positions. And by the same token, Israeli Jews have to see that world Jewry actually has a legitimate equal stake in the destiny and legacy of the Jewish people. Somebody said to me recently that, hey, just remember that the greatest Jewish document of all time, the Talmud, was a diaspora document. I mean, the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud that we mostly use, right? That was a diaspora document. So to not take diaspora Jewry's past or future seriously is a mistake. But we need to do work on the ground in Israel as well to help condition the environment. We're trying to launch a movement, Dan, and movements are messy and they're decentralized and they don't always follow a straight line. But just like any of the movements that have made a difference, there's a decentralized aspect to it. But that's what can move mountains at the end of the day. And so this Zionism 3.0 conference began with the idea, frankly, in September of 2014 when the Iran deal was heating up. I started hosting a lot of speakers here at the JCC that were against the Iran deal. And I personally felt and feel that the Iran deal was a bad deal. So I was bringing speaker after speaker. And then one of my board members very gently and quietly, like a mensch, pulled me aside and said, hey, are you going to have anybody talk about why the deal might be a good deal? And I was like, no, what? What are you, crazy? This is bad for the Jews, bad for America, bad for Israel. And he said, look, I know you want to make your JCC and JCCs in general the living room for the Jewish people. And you might want to consider having alternative viewpoints. So I went and I did some soul searching. I really had to think about this. I said, I can't possibly give a platform, give an oxygen to someone who's going to talk about why the Iran deal is a good deal because I don't believe it. But I realized that the JCC is bigger than just me and my own version of Judaism or Zionism or even Kashrut. So we decided to host a panel with two people in favor of the Iran deal, two people against the Iran deal, and we had an NPR correspondent who was kind of the moderator, and it was a huge success. We had 800 people show up. We didn't even have room for 800 people in the hall. We had to live stream it to one of our adjoining rooms, and we realized there's a need for this. And you recall at that time, there was a huge schism in the Jewish community over the Iran deal, and we were seeing it happen around Israel as well. I mean, it's been happening for a while now, and we thought, okay, if we could do this on Iran, and it was successful. So we said, all right, we need to do this around the issues pertaining to the Israelis, Palestinians, Zionism as well. So we decided to host a Zionism 3.0 conference. We reached out to Haaretz newspaper to co-sponsor with us. We brought in the left and the right and the center. We had Peter Beinart. We had Jeffrey Goldberg. We had Brett Stevens. We had Tzipi Chotoveli. We had Arab MKs. We had across the board people, and it was a vibrant conversation. And when I stood up to welcome everyone and introduce the conference, I said, look, we're going to disagree respectfully here. I want you to have disagreements. I want you to challenge the speakers, but we need to do it respectfully. And I said, I invited people to speak at this conference with whom I personally disagree, vehemently, who I disagree with. And I want to model good behavior because that's the way we're going to move this conversation forward. We successfully did it in 2016 again, 2017, sold out every year. We continue to bring bigger and bigger speakers. And then we started getting calls from around the country saying, hey, can you help us do this? And we realized this was something bigger than just a one-day conference. So we've gotten a little bit of funding and some energy behind making this a movement and helping other communities try and start this and turn it into a movement.
So clearly, all three of us talking, we love X.0 framings. We've talked about JOS 4.0, we've got Zionism 3.0, all sorts of .0s. And I'm a very math-oriented kind of guy, so whenever I've got decimals in play, I'm going to think about numbers and all that. But what it got me thinking about is since we're towards the end of this arc on Israel, I'm thinking back to some of our earliest episodes, and what we heard from some of our guests is that really there was such a wide diversity of Zionisms, plural, before the founding of the state of Israel. So I mean, look, ultimately you got Zionism 3.0 isn't some terrible choice. There's always going to be people that you can choose some other number, and we've talked about that with how many eras of Judaism there are. But I guess I'm curious to think about sort of Zionism 0.0 or Zionism -1 or those pieces before, and sort of reflect on just this vast expanse of Zionisms that have been out there, including, for our listeners that were along for the ride early on, Zionisms that weren't just about Jewish statehood. And so I guess I'm wondering if there's room, or if you've created sort of context for a historical look back or an educational kind of session where people think about what Zionism even means. All that's to say, is there a discussion of sort of those pre-1.0 Zionisms, or maybe the decimals in between the .0s, whatever mathematical system works for us? Does that component make it in, or could that be a piece in the future?
Absolutely. I think there's a place for any of the decimals or integers or negative numbers. Or I don't know if you know Gil Troy, but he's this great scholar on Zionism, and he just published a book called The Zionist Ideas, and it's meant to be an updated version of Arthur Hertzberg's classic The Zionist Idea. And he similarly frames it with, he doesn't use the terminology 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, but he talks about the pioneers, the builders, and then today it's the torchbearers, right? But amongst the pioneers, the early thinkers around Zionism, and even to use your terminology, kind of pre-Zionism, there's absolutely room in the canon for us to study this, talk about this, and to have events at JCCs or synagogues or wherever else to learn. And part of what people are looking for these days, and I think that's why Judaism Unbound is so popular, is people are looking for new ways to learn. They're looking for unorthodox ways to come about their knowledge, whether it's Talmud, whether it's Zionism, whether it's laws of kashrut. And so there's absolutely room for that. We've done a little bit of that, Lex. We haven't spent a ton of time doing the history or historiography around Zionism, but I'm hoping that we'll do more as this takes off. I also don't take for granted the fact that not all Jews were Zionists. You know, when Noam Pianko was on your show, he gave a great historical overview of how there was deep anti-Zionism amongst the Jewish community back in the day. And being here in the Bay Area, one of the seats for the anti-Zionist Jewish movement was in San Francisco. So Jews have never agreed on this stuff. I don't know why I think we would agree in the future. I don't. I guess I'm just looking for a little bit more civil conversation around the topic, a little bit more agreement, kind of baselines for conversation and ways to see each other. But I'm not Pollyannish and expecting that all Jews are going to finally agree that, oh, let's agree to disagree. I think one of the big questions that we have to answer for ourselves is where these red lines are drawn, right? I feel a lot of sympathy for my friends who run Hillels on college campuses and are feeling a ton of pressure because they have Jews on the campus who are fighting every single day against the BDS movement, only to have some of the leaders of the BDS movement be the Jews who then want to come to have Shabbat dinner at that same Hillel and sit right next to those same kids who are fighting against it. I have my own thoughts about that, but I don't want to be doctrinaire about it. I think other communities need to determine for themselves where those lines are.
You know, part of Zionism 3.0 is also the growing power of the ultra-Orthodox in Israeli society and the increasing struggles about sort of religious pluralism in Israel and the realities of the situation between Israel and the Palestinians, which no matter what fingers of blame one might point, right, the fact that you have a situation of, you know, the occupation 50 years later, it's very different from how it was 10 years later, right? And so, you know, the realities that we're dealing with in Israel are these growing phenomena that I think are troubling to a lot of American Jews. And in terms of, and the thing that I feel like I'm struggling to sort of think about and articulate is this question of, what if I knew a wonderful person in my life who turned out that they were very charitable and they did all kinds of wonderful things for others, but it turned out that they made their money in some kind of unethical business. At the end of the day, I would probably have to say, despite all the wonderful philanthropy that person is doing, I don't really approve of that person because I don't approve of the way that he made his money. And I feel like there's this element that I'm struggling to sort of talk about Israel. How do we hold both the wonderful things that come out of Israel and the really deeply problematic things, especially I'm not here to debate whether they're problematic or not, but it's clear that for large numbers of American Jews, they are problematic. And so the question in a way is, how do we suggest in the world of Zionism 3.0 that somebody relate to Israel if they're a person who has these real problems with some of the big parts of what's going on in Israeli society today?
Dan, I think that we have to be willing to address these folks as family, right? To use your analogy, which I'm not sure I agree with, but that's okay. If you have somebody that you held up with this ideal only to learn that they had made their money in an unsavory way, but that was a family member, you might treat them differently if there was just some guy who happened to go to shul with you, right? Or happened to play on your soccer team or happened to be in your yoga group. You might be like, ugh, I want nothing to do with that person. But if it's a family member, you don't really have a choice. So you sit with them, you take them to dinner, you have a glass of wine, you say, what's the story? Maybe there's a story that we don't know. Maybe we have to listen and help that person, right? And if we approach through Zionism, the Zionism 3.0 lens encourages us to approach the Israelis as family. At the end of the day, this is about Jewish peoplehood, right? We care about Jews in Russia because they're family, they're Jews, right? They may have such different politics than us, Dan. We may abhor their politics, but if they're Jews in Russia or they're Jews in Yemen or they're Jews in Ethiopia or Saudi Arabia or somewhere where they're hurting, we're going to reach out and hug them, and we're going to help them, and we're going to actually rescue them if they need rescue. But why is it that when Jews live in Israel and they have political views that are abhorrent to us, we're not willing to do the same thing, right? And by the way, it's challenging here in this country as well. In America, you get somebody whose political views are opposite to yours, and it's hard to sit across the table from them, even if they're Jews. But we have to see them as family, because if we don't, I think that the alternative is dire.
But then I think the red line question comes up, because one could argue that the Jews who support BDS, they're also family. And rather than saying they have crossed some line where they have put themselves outside the tent and we have to lump them in with these non-Jews who may have bad intentions for Israel, which seems to be the line that a lot of folks take, instead to say, hey, these are family too. And if we're talking about family, then it feels like that has to cut in both directions. And if we're not talking about family, right, which I think is also, it's something that we've explored in this podcast, and I'm certainly very open to the idea that perhaps the family metaphor has run its course or isn't as powerful as it used to be. And if that's the case, then that also cuts in both directions, and then one of the questions that we have is, how do we think about Israel in a sort of post-family metaphor? So I guess that, I really would like to sort of talk a little bit about this question of who's in the tent, because I think that we're trying our best on this podcast to take the biggest tent possible approach to that, right? And to say that we can talk to anybody and to really encourage folks to have that mindset of talking to anybody. And I don't mean anybody in the world, right? I mean, our podcast is focused on people who understand themselves in a deep way to be engaged in this question of what is the future for the Jewish people. And they're doing that in good faith. And I believe that there certainly are many folks who are doing that in good faith, who have political views to the right and to the left that are way beyond where I feel comfortable. But because I believe that they themselves are holding those views in good faith, I feel like they're in the tent, as I see it.
There's a friend I have who's a real thought leader who believes that we should be willing, as at Jewish organizations in America, to have people come who represent as diverse views as the Israeli Knesset. Because after all, why be holier than the Pope, right? If the Israeli Knesset is willing to have anti-Zionists sit in the Israeli Knesset, as they do, why shouldn't American Jewish organizations allow these folks? And my response is we do allow them. It doesn't mean I'm going to give them a platform. It doesn't mean I'm going to invite them to speak. So I will have people who might be pro-BDS come and be part of the audience, come and work out in our JCC, send their kids to our preschool. I don't have a litmus test that way. But when I have speakers, I don't necessarily need to invite them as speakers. I can rule out those on the far left and the far right, and I consider the BDS as an anti-Israel, anti-Zionist movement, right? And maybe not every BDSer is anti-Zionist, but the movement itself wants to end Israel as a Jewish state. So I don't feel that I need to invite somebody in the BDS movement to speak at the JCC. But again, if you're a part of the BDS movement and you want to come and participate and be a member of the audience and ask questions, bavakasha, God bless, come, be a part of the conversation.
Let's talk about, like, not the BDS movement per se, because, we can all argue about the definitions of movements, but I guess my question is more like, what if there was somebody, and you've done this, Peter Beinart, for example, he, in his book, The Crisis of Zionism, he advocated a boycott of the Israeli settlements, right? To boycott, and you didn't, because you invited him to speak there, but a lot of organizations said, well, because he said the word boycott, he has now aligned himself with the BDS movement, which is, off the table, and now Peter Beinart is an enemy, where he himself, in his own understanding, and, and I think in most people's understanding who actually have read his work, he's not only not in favor of BDS, and he's not only not anti-Israel, he's actually criticized by much of the left for being too pro-Israel, but just because of uttering the one word of boycott, he sort of unleashed this incredibly powerful counter attack. And I guess I'd be interested in your reflections on that, both sort of as an observer, but also as someone who is tasked with what I know is an extremely difficult task, because I had it when I was a Hillel director, of trying to run a big tent Jewish organization with all the pressures from funders and from the community and from all kinds of other directions to say, on the one hand, we want to try to create the biggest tent that we can. On the other hand, we have to survive in the face of all these pressures. Right.
You just got right to the heart of the matter in some ways. I'll invite Peter Beinart to speak, even though I think that he's on the wrong side of this argument. I think that most individuals feel like Jews should be able to live wherever Jews want to live, just like Muslims, Christians, people of any ethnicity, any background should be able to live wherever they want to live. I went and visited an area in Ariel, which is over the Green Line. And some of the coolest stuff they're doing there is coexistence work. There's a soccer program where little kids, little Palestinian boys and little Palestinian girls and little Israeli boys and Israeli girls living over the Green Line are playing soccer together. But they're not able to fundraise. Why? Because most Jewish American nonprofit organizations that are mainstream are not giving any money over the Green Line. In fact, this is America's foreign policy. Nobody's really parsed this out, Dan. Nobody's willing to say this out loud. But America's foreign policy is a pro-boycott policy. I mean, we have in American law that U.S. foreign aid to Israel can't be spent over the Green Line. That's essentially putting on paper that a U.S. boycott is kosher, right? So I'm not in favor of that personally, but I would invite those people to be part of my community, part of my conversation, even speak on the stage.
I'm really glad we are going there, because I think this is one of the touchiest and hardest issues. And for me, it was my entryway into any conversations about Israel, was me as a college student engaging with my friends and really close friends and people who were part of the Hillel ecosystem in every measurable way, part of that community, who were told that their views on Israel were not part of the tent because they weren't Zionists. And I wanted to respond to the point you made about folks can certainly come and be a part of these conversations, but not be on the panels, because I think that's used in a lot of places. And look, I think that there are people out there for whom that will resonate, and I want to put forth the alternative viewpoint that that's a tough message to send to folks, and listeners can sort through what feels right. But for me, I would talk with folks when I was a student and just entering into these issues and say things like that it's not that we don't want you to be part of our community. It's just that we can't have folks who have your viewpoints, or you yourselves sort of leading Hillel-sponsored events, et cetera, et cetera. And what I constantly heard as pushback, and which I eventually was not able to respond to, was that sounds a lot like saying, women are welcome to be in Jewish communities, but they can't be rabbis. Or LGBTQ folks are allowed to be part of communities, but can't be rabbis. Or today, people who are in interfaith relationships, absolutely, we want you to be part of our communities, but leading is not something that you can do. You can perhaps have a seat at the table, but that step of sort of organizing the table, inviting others to the table, is not one that is open to you. And so, look, I think that there are communities that are going to continue to have lines wherever they have them. And more, there's actually communities that have lines on the right too. But the other piece that's a more open-ended question I have is, I think all of us do agree, all three of us and many of our listeners, that the relationship between American Judaism and Israel that we've been analyzing, we'd love it to be a two-way street or a multi-way street, all sorts of lanes on this street or highway. And what I always think back to my own trip to Israel in high school, which was organized through my Jewish summer camp. And I have many critiques of it, but actually it was, in the grand scheme, a really fantastic trip because it included, as part of it, all of the 11th graders that we met, all of the Israelis that were our sort of community that we connected with in Israel. They came back to the U.S. for 2 weeks and spent time in American Jewish communities. And that sent the implicit and explicit message that they have something to learn from us too. And so I guess I'm wondering on that front, would part of your vision be that Israelis actually have some form of American Judaism 3.0 or 4.0 or whatever, a gathering that's all about them learning about what American Judaism looks like, to really hammer home that point that this is a two-way street, and it's not only that we can learn from them, but that they can learn from us?
So I'll take your second one first, because yes, absolutely. In fact, part of what this new initiative is, this between Zionism 3.0, us at the JCC, and Reut in Israel, is an attempt to build more of a reverse birthright model. We need to be thoughtful about how we bring Israelis over here so that they can have a similar experience and then go back to Israel and say, wow, look at what they're doing Jewishly in America. I didn't even think about it. Because here, we don't even have the language to talk about this, Lex. In Israel, most Israelis think you're either religious or you're chiloni, right? And chiloni has no translation except for secular. But we wouldn't consider ourselves secular just because we're not Orthodox. But in Israel, it's Orthodox, is religious, is traditional, and then there's chiloni. But here in America, we have so many different vibrant layers between those two that we have to show it to Israelis so they see it and they can go back and go, wow, this is the cultural Judaism that I love. This is even the spiritual religious Judaism that I love. Now, as to your first question, which is the much harder one, I don't want this analogy of, we'll allow women or gays to come to the table but not be part of the leadership. I don't want that to be the defining ethos of me at our JCC saying, we'll allow you pro-BDSers to come and be a part of the community and be a part of the conversation, but I'm not going to invite you to speak. So I feel like I want to respond to that just to be able to have it out there. I don't think that any Jewish organization should have an obligation to invite just any point of view, just because, well, it's an open marketplace of ideas. And as I said, JCC should be the living room for the Jewish community. That doesn't mean you would invite the most hostile right-wing or left-wing person in American politics to come and speak at your synagogue or your Hillel or your JCC. And that's what I mean by creating red lines, Lex. Mine happens to be in one place versus someone else's can be in another place. I actually think that these young people who are involved with these movements that are Israel-related but are not where I am with Israel, that's better than them just checking out altogether, right? That's the bigger threat, is these young people being like, I don't understand this country. They're doing crazy stuff, which then gives me a bad rap because I'm a Jew. So my friends are like, look what's happening over there. I don't understand the language. Israelis are pushy. I'm just going to check out altogether, right? Like, that's the worst situation of all. So where I draw my line is, we used to have this saying that you shouldn't have tolerance for intolerance. But I felt like the moral relativism that was happening for so long, especially on college campuses where, what? Don't judge him just because he's an anti-Semite. That's the way he believes. So he's an anti-Semite. So you like Jews. Don't judge him. Everyone gets to have their own opinion. I don't believe that. I don't think we have to have tolerance for intolerance. And there's certain speakers and certain movements and certain organizations out there that preach intolerance. And we as JCCs or Hillels or other organizations don't have to have people who preach intolerance as our speakers.
The question, I guess, is when we have organizations like Hillel or the JCCs that purport and claim to be big tents for the entire Jewish community, there's sort of, I think, an expectation, and I think a reasonable expectation on the part of your average Jew who shows up that says, hey, I can hear my perspective heard here. I can feel that this place represents me. And yet I think the reality is that we tend to see that a big chunk of the left doesn't feel that way about some of these sort of mainstream Jewish organizations. And in a sense, the question is, what do we do about that? I mean, it's reasonable to say, well, that's just the way these organizations are. You don't have to join these organizations. But those same organizations go around and say that they are the big tent of the Jewish community. And I would be okay with, Hillel, for example, saying, hey, we're the home for a part of the Jewish community, and if they would be strongly encouraging of creating another organization that was the home for the other part of the Jewish community. But that's not what they say. They say that we're the central address. And so what I'm trying to wrap my head around is, if you're the central address, then don't you have to have a super liberal policy of connection, of allowing people in on both sides? I mean, when we talked about this series, you and I, Zack, and I want to get to this because one of the things that, you encouraged us to have some voices of folks that were more on the right than we felt represented us and that we felt really fully comfortable with. And we probed at it, and I asked you, why is that important? And I said that ultimately, right, what this podcast is about is trying to speak to the experience of those who feel that they're not connecting to the existing institutions of the Jewish community, and that it feels to me like the people who are not connecting to the institutions of the Jewish community because of Israel are not connecting because they see those organizations as too far to the right, and that there aren't too many people who are not connecting because they see them as too far to the left. And you said, no, but there also are some of those. And then I said, oh, yeah, well, let's talk about that. So I want to be able to talk about that. But I also want to say that I think that an organization like a Hillel or a JCC is different from Judaism Unbound, because Judaism Unbound does not purport to represent the entire Jewish community. We're here to represent a very particular group of people who feel sort of on the margins of the Jewish community. So that's the part that I'm trying to sort of puzzle out. I don't really see why a Hillel or a JCC shouldn't go as far to the right and left as they possibly can. And I feel like they go farther to the right than to the left, I guess is what I would put out there as a hypothesis.
First of all, we do also have tent poles on the right, not just the left, right? Otherwise, it's a lean-to if there's only poles on one side. And by the way, it's a tarp. If there's no poles anywhere, it just lies on the ground. So I can take this metaphor as far as you want me to. But on the right, we won't bring people in who are right-wing one-staters who believe in, expelling the Palestinians, or the Palestinians don't have their own national rights. We won't bring them either. So we have limitations on the left and the right. But I like this question, Dan, because I think that there are folks who are center-right and even more right that are feeling left out of quote-unquote mainstream or those institutions, especially in the Bay Area, which is a very liberal place. If you're a liberal Jew in the Bay Area and you're liberal on the social issues, whether it's pro-gay rights, pro-women's rights, part of the Me Too movement, pro-gun control, but you're a hawk on Israeli security issues, you're out. And look at what's happening on the national scene with the liberal movements. You can't be a Zionist and feel at home in any of these movements. And I think that if you were to go to some of these communities around the country that are a little bit more liberal in their social domestic views, and you start to exclaim how you feel a little more hawkish on Israeli security issues, you'd quickly feel yourself an outsider. And then, of course, you take these arguments all the way to the extreme, and the question always becomes, would you have invited Hitler to speak, right? So institutions, organizations, nonprofits, companies have a right to draw a line wherever they see fit based on the morals and values that they hold dear. And some JCCs are going to be more liberal than this one, and some are going to be more conservative, but I don't fault them for that.
I don't doubt for a minute that they have the right to set those lines. I think this is helping me sort of hone in on what I'm asking, is that they don't seem to often want to take responsibility for the fact that in choosing that line, there are consequences, and that those consequences. So for example, again, I know the Hillel world better, and I don't know less about what the situation is with JCCs. But when Hillel takes a hard line about saying that we don't allow certain views in Hillel, that has the effect of driving many, many Jewish students away. Now, if you want to say, yes, we know that has that effect, and we're doing it anyway, fine. But it seems like they're trying to have their cake and eat it too by saying that we think that we can take this line, and anybody who's driven away by it just doesn't understand it well enough.
I have no problem saying that we are not for everyone. I really do. Mm-hmm. I have no problem saying we might not be right for you. If you're a member of Jewish Voice for Peace and you are upset with us because we won't invite a speaker that is pro-BDS, then we might not be the right community for you. I try to have as big and broad a tent as possible. I think Yehuda Kurtzer once said that there's kind of this spectrum. On one end are community organizations, and then the other end are advocacy organizations. Community organizations should have a lot of different opinions. Advocacy organizations should not. Everyone should be kind of rowing in the same direction, right? I can tell you that the Santa Clara County, where this JCC is in Palo Alto, 20% of voters voted for Donald Trump. Okay, so that means I have to assume that maybe 1 out of every 5 of the people who come to this JCC is a Trump supporter. That's not in the liberal Bay Area. Amongst the Jews in the liberal Bay Area, probably not a ton of them. I do know some of them, but I still have to be a community-based organization that is open and welcoming to everyone, regardless of their political views. But maybe in Berkeley, they don't want to feel like they have to have as wide a tent, and that's their right. So I make it very clear, Dan, to your point that if this isn't right for you, it's okay. It's like Groucho Marx said, maybe I don't want to be a member of a club that would have me anyway.
I want to try and synthesize this because I think this calls back to Melissa Weintraub and her episode where she talked about the poles of moral clarity and inclusion. And I'm actually flashing back even to our conversation about what is a Jewish community center. Jewish ? Community ? Center ? I think that was our name for that episode. What does center mean? Is it a community center for all of the Jewish community? Is it where do we draw those parentheses to indicate what Jewish community center means? So I think that all of us, we're a podcast in the business of grand visions and of deciding what we wish to see in Judaism. And I think what all of us needs to ask is, what's the balance of moral clarity and inclusion? On the question of Israel, I think it's most pressing because we see how urgent it is and all the lines that literally create and recreate Jewish communities. But what does it mean to be at once a kind of representative organization? Because in certain respects, that is what some Jewish organizations are, but also to be an organization that isn't for everyone, as you just said. How does that tension happen? What should it look like? What's the threshold? I mean, you talked about if 20% of the Jewish community or 20% of the Bay Area community thinks X, that might be a threshold whereby the institution needs to be there for them. Is there a threshold at which, if 10% or 20% or 30% of the Jewish community supported BDS or supported whatever, that a Jewish community center would need to be there for them independent of what their institutional leanings are? It feels to me the answer needs to be yes, because if it was 100% on any issue and they felt like there was a red line there, then the community would just die. But what is that threshold? Where should it be? I think these are questions that all of us should be wrestling with. My personal leaning, because I've experienced, we all have biases in this, because I've experienced the outside of those, and even when I was in the Hillel infrastructure, when I was on Hillel International's board of directors, I was told that my own viewpoints would not be reasonable in certain Hillel contexts. And so my leaning is on most of these issues towards the inclusion point, even on the end that is opposed to my own. And that gets me in struggles with my own activist communities, where I would actually extend those tent poles even on the right in ways that would make many people uncomfortable. So I just want to ask, this is a question for each of us, but it's also a question for our listeners to just ask, where am I on this tension? What are my lines? And where might I push myself a little farther, either on the moral clarity side or the inclusion side, to think, maybe that could be the future of the Jewish community. So I apologize that wasn't addressed to you, Zach, but to the listeners. But if you or even Dan, if anybody has thoughts on that, I think in the interest of sort of synthesizing this whole unit, it could be great to wrestle with.
I love that question. And I think you actually framed it really well. We have to be the example as leaders or reluctant leaders to set the example. And so that's why I've gone out of my moral comfort zone to invite people, be more inclusive, to invite people that I disagree with. But I also think that the answer to the question, Lex, not that there's one answer, but the answer is that this evolves, right? It's not static, it's dynamic. And so what was once morally abhorrent could one day become morally acceptable, and vice versa, right? So where our moral clarity lines are drawn vary from generation to generation, individual to individual, organization to organization. So it's okay for us to be struggling with this. I love that we're struggling with this. There's this famous piece in the Torah when Moses is sent to Sinai to get the Ten Commandments. And I'm going to get this wrong, Lex, but you're the rabbinic student, so you can correct me. But the people are afraid, right? Because God shows himself in this cloud. And it's in the cloud where God is most seen and most clear. But it's ironic because that's kind of the cloudy area. And yet God is most powerful there, so that the people say, we don't want to do this, Moses, you go do it on our behalf. So perhaps in the cloudiness, perhaps in this area that's the most murky, is where we're doing the most spiritual. We're getting closest to God. And that's where things are kind of fuzzy.
So I just think it's interesting to sort of, as we wrap up, to think back to what Zionism 3.0 might be all about. On the one hand, and I've said this before, that I think it's a little bit too much to expect of American Jews to offer some kind of uncompromising support of Israel in a time when they don't feel that way about their own country, the United States, right? Where they feel, in a world in which American Jews feel so angry and upset and embarrassed by having Donald Trump as the president of the United States, it's hard to imagine that they ought to feel any other way about Israel. If they have problems with what Israel's doing, then of course they are gonna feel that way and should be able to articulate it. On the other hand, if American Jews, as I think many of us are committed to this fight for America, then what might that look like when applied to Israel, even if you acknowledge, right, even for a person who says that, Israel's doing terrible things, like even more terrible than any of us might think. Well, even if that's the case, isn't there an argument to be made in a world of Zionism 3.0 that the answer is somehow some form of engagement and trying to fix that? The reason why I think this is so important to put in the frame of Zionism 3.0 is because it feels like the frame in Zionism 2.0 was, that's not your role, American Jews. You either take it or leave it. And I think that in that environment, they're saying, look, if you're telling me take it or leave it, I guess I'll leave it. But in a Zionism 3.0, I feel like what you're saying is, no, don't say take it or leave it. Say, get involved and try to fix it, but you don't have to make Aliyah, move to Israel in order to get involved in fixing it. And that's, I think, kind of brings me back full circle to my question from the beginning. It's like, but what if the Israelis aren't saying that? How do we sort of lead to an environment where the Israelis are and American Jewish leaders who haven't felt this way in the world of Zionism 2.0 say, you know what? Okay, yeah, I do get it that it's okay for folks to say, I want Israel to change, and my support of Israel is dependent on the fact of whether I see Israel trying to really change some of these things. And if Israel seems like it's not trying to change them, then I'm going to try to get involved. But if there's no place for me, then, it's okay for me to wait it out or something like that, as opposed to the demand for unconditional support that seemed to be core to Zionism 2.0.
2.0 is you get a stake without a say. And if Zionism 3.0 is about having a stake and a say, then the question becomes, all right, what's the appropriate way to have a say? I would say get on the ground in Israel. Doesn't mean you have to make Aliyah necessarily, but get there and work with those who are actually trying to make change on the ground. The good news is, Dan, as you know, It's a different environment in Israel today. There are change makers on the ground who are trying to change things. But don't walk away. Just like Americans who don't like our current president, to your point, Dan, aren't going to now go move to Canada and not pay taxes. I mean, some might, but I think you and I would argue that that's not the way to do it. So if you feel that way about Israel, then go to Israel. Invest your time, energy, have some skin in the game. But it's always much better than this person, as I said before, who just bows out altogether and says, look, I'm done. I don't get that place. I'm confused. That's the difference at the end of the day, Dan, between Zionism 2.0 and Zionism 3.0. Zionism 3.0 says maybe we should have a say as well as a stake, and let's figure out the right way to do it. You know, when you're disagreeing with your partner, your life partner, your business partner, you don't have let's take your life partner. When you're disagreeing with your life partner, there's a way to do it, right? You can argue with your wife or your husband behind closed doors, but then you wouldn't go out in the middle of the street and start yelling, calling her names so all the neighbors can hear. You wouldn't do that. And if you did, you wouldn't stay married for very long. Or you wouldn't get your way. It's not like the neighbors putting pressure on your partner is going to make your partner be like, oh, well, I guess he was right after all. So for American Jews to do that to Israel is counterproductive. It just puts the Israelis back up against a wall. It doesn't actually work. So I don't think that American Jews' relationship with Israel should be all about the criticism of the things they think they're doing wrong. In a familiar relationship with Israel, like you do with your life partner, you can argue around the Shabbat table and scream and yell, and then you go out in public and you do it a little bit differently. I'm not sure what the rules are for that, Dan. I don't know how to create those boundaries, but I know that the way that the American Jewish community has been doing it up until recently has been a little challenging for people. And that's been the reluctance for people to kind of dive right into a Zionism 3.0, because they're like, whoa, is this just another vehicle to create legitimate criticism of Israel? Right? And that's not what we're saying. It's a little bit more nuanced than that. It's a vehicle to have a back and forth, Israeli Jews contributing to American Jewish society and American Jews contributing to Israeli society.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Zach. This has been a great conversation. Are you our first three-peat guest?
No, I think
Benet was three. You're our
Benet's
second
three-peat.
three-peat. Next one will be our three-peat. But thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Lex. Thanks, Dan. I appreciate being on the show. You guys are doing great stuff.
And as we close out this episode, we want to say, as we always do at the end of episodes, that we really love it when you are in touch with us. And there are a variety of ways for you to do that. The first is that you can head to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Second, you can head to our Twitter at Judaism Unbound. Third, you can go to our website, JudaismUnbound.com. And last but not least, you can hit us up via email at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. The last plug we like to make is that you can support us with a financial donation, either on a one-time basis or a monthly recurring basis, and you can do either of those at JudaismUnbound.com/donate. So thanks so much for listening, and with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.